Welcome to Whitewater Leadership. My name is George Hutchinson and I'm Chief Exec and founder of River EFRA. River EFRA is a crisis and reputational risk advisory firm, and I've spent the best part of the last 30 years advising business leaders and leaders of organisations and charities when they're facing into major risks and systemic threats and crises. And I'm joined today by my co-host, Polly Neate. Polly.
Thanks, George. Thanks, everyone, for listening to the podcast. I'm Polly Neate. I'm an expert advisor for River EFRA, and I also convene the Social Insights panel for the Future Governance Forum. I'm really excited to be co-hosting this series of podcasts which look at what I think are some of the most significant challenges facing leaders in any sector, as George said. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the wisdom of some of the most well-respected leaders in the charity sector. As a former chief executive myself of Shelter and Women's Aid, I've definitely had my share of some Whitewater experiences in my time.
Our guest for this episode is Juliet Bouverie. Juliet is Chief Executive of the Stroke Association and a former director at Macmillan. Juliet, welcome, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Juliet.
Just to open and to give the audience a little bit of an understanding of who you are, clearly charity chief execs are facing into a lot of challenges these days, and managing your way through risk. What is it that you think makes a good leader in a charity to be able to help them manage risk?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is the world in which we're living is just so complex. It's very difficult to kind of anticipate what's going to happen next. So we're facing risk on every level. And I think the most important thing is to be really clear about what you're trying to achieve. Always keep your purpose front of mind. Second thing is, the thing that I have found most helpful in times of uncertainty is to go back to the organisation's values, because they so often help guide not only the decisions that you make, but also how you kind of show up and behave in times of uncertainty and crisis. And just, you can never over communicate. I mean, I really found during the COVID pandemic, when none of us knew what the answers were and the ground rules were changing all the time, the most important thing is, even when I and frankly the rest of the world didn't have answers, the important thing was just to keep the lines of communication open, to be really transparent, and actually to keep asking for feedback, because actually it was a lot of kind of our frontline staff who were closest to the action, who often had some of the very best answers. So having those kind of feedback loops to inform your decisions as chief exec is absolutely critical.
So in this conversation, we're going to focus a bit on when you have to lead and manage large-scale organisational change, so restructuring, other kind of transformational change programmes. And one of the things that strikes me about that is that in charities, there's quite limited resource actually to manage all of that well. If you compare it to the private sector, there's a lot, the kind of back office, so-called, is much bigger, and the resources that leaders have to draw on in that sector are much more considerable. What do you think the issues are that creates for charity chief execs?
Yeah, I mean, I can draw on two specific examples. I mean, the first was the kind of tough choices we had to make when the pandemic hit, because I'm sure lots of people you've interviewed are kind of mentioning that as an example. But it was a time when obviously our fundraised income just pretty much dried up.
Yeah.
And so we had to take some really tough choices. And I think the way that we got through it, and we did actually get through it quite well, was I remember my boss telling me, never waste a good crisis. It was a bit of an opportunity to be really bold and to do some things that we wanted to do, but to do them at a speed that the pandemic demanded. So that was kind of one thing. And secondly, I really didn't want to salami slice our costs, because I just thought that's really not strategic, and we've got to come out of this strong. So we actually took our time to kind of think through what is the future operating model that we need to deliver our strategy. And we took our time to restructure. We did do it all at once. There are pros and cons associated with that. I think the advantage is everyone was in the same boat and people weren't looking over their shoulders thinking, oh my goodness, what next? Disadvantage was it obviously created a lot of disruption and we lost a lot of momentum. But the other thing that we did, which obviously doesn't so often happen in the private sector, is we didn't have a huge budget for redundancies, and we wanted to avoid redundancies because it was a really difficult time for our staff and their families. We wanted, wherever possible, to guarantee employment. And actually, we've got 800 staff. We actually only had just over 20 forced redundancies. We had about a dozen voluntary redundancies, but we came out of it really strong and staff engagement was really high at the end of it. But I think it was because we took our time to kind of design it strategically, and staff were really clear about the reasons why we were designing the change. And on the whole, we took staff with us, and where we made mistakes, we very quickly admitted to them, corrected them, and then at the end of the total organisation restructure, we did do a lessons learned, and we shared that with all staff. We do a monthly Ask Juliet, and so we were very kind of transparent about the lessons that we learned, and it stood us in good stead. I think the thing that we didn't do was invest enough alongside the structural change with the kind of development of capabilities and the cultural change. So what we did is we did the structural change, which is emotionally demanding, and was necessary because we had to make financial cuts, but we underestimated the importance of kind of investing in new ways of working and developing staff capabilities. So I think if we were to do it again now, I think we would probably avoid a whole organisation restructure and invest much more in kind of new ways of working and developing the capabilities we need to be successful for the future.
And I think for me, in a way, looking at it and having worked with a number of charities that have gone through quite significant change programs and restructures, one of the challenges is kind of keeping your people on board, because the beauty for me of a charitable organisation is people join because they actually fundamentally believe in the cause and the mission. And that means their personal commitment to the organisation is far greater than it might be for other organisations. The challenge is that their commitment is internalized and personal as well, which means they can face in slightly different directions. And so when you go through quite painful experiences, how do you actually keep them on board, and how do you make sure that you don't end up in a kind of, I guess, survivor syndrome where the people left in the organization don't feel quite as committed to it into the future?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that it's an emotional journey, isn't it? And you're so right. People are so invested in the cause and the organisation's purpose. And at the Stroke Association, a lot of our staff are themselves stroke survivors, or they're very personally affected by the condition. So they feel they're really committed. And, they give a huge amount of their kind of energy and passion to the cause. So I think, when you're going through that kind of large scale organisational restructure, you have to kind of remember the emotional burden. And we did have some of that survivorship guilt, I'll be honest with you. When staff left or voluntarily moved on, it was tough for staff left behind, and they did feel guilty. And I think now I would kind of allow more time for that. Luckily, we'd been through the pandemic and we realised the importance of kind of well-being at the heart of our strategy. We'd always had a good employee assistance programme. And we were really, I think, quite kind of pioneering in adopting flexible working quite some time ago.
Before the pandemic.
Well before the pandemic. So we've been big on flexible working for quite a long time. But I think because of what we learned during the pandemic about you've got to put well-being and kind of well-being and voice, I think, at the heart of your strategy, that did help us when we went through the organisational restructuring, because we had a lot of lessons that we'd learned, and we built a lot of goodwill with staff. And I just kept communicating all the time about what we were doing, why we were doing it. We kept going back to our North Star all the time, not trying to kind of hide some of the challenges and concerns that staff were experiencing, but trying to maintain communication. It's always difficult. It's always painful. But you've got to kind of keep that narrative going. And I think you've got to keep it going for well after you've completed the restructuring, because it's easy to think, oh, now I've got all the pieces in place. Now we're going to be able to deliver our strategy at the pace and agility that stroke survivors need. Well, it doesn't happen as miraculously as that. You've just got to keep working at it all the time. And I think the thing that we did interestingly after the pandemic is we then set ourselves 3 big, hairy, audacious goals, like you do. And we set those up as our transformational change programs. And we followed kind of old ways of thinking, which is to set them up as traditional programs with work streams and kind of project managers and a program management office. And my goodness me, it just paralyzed us into inaction because we overscoped these big, hairy, audacious goals. And so now what we've learned is you've got to chunk it up into really small, bite-sized problems, bite-sized change. We're adopting much more of kind of agile methodologies, agile practices that they use in the private sector to kind of get the change going at the pace that you need. Because if you scope it too big, people don't know where to start. Whereas if you scope it small and take a specific problem that's affecting a specific customer and you start there, then actually you start to see the change more quickly.
Can I just delve into that a bit? Because I think there's senior leaders listening to this who'll be thinking about the programme office they've just set up and the programme management approach that they're sort of struggling to resource. And they'll be thinking, hang on a minute, is that not what we want? And so I'm really interested in what you think the risks are of that approach to change management. Like what does go wrong with that? Or what should people watch out for if that's what they're planning on doing?
Yeah. I mean, it didn't work for us at the Stroke Association, so I'm not saying it couldn't work elsewhere. But I think over the years, just realised that, yes, you need a strategy because you need a clear sense of purpose, direction, and you've got to start with the end outcomes in mind. But I have never, in the 30 plus years I've worked in the voluntary sector, seen a 3-year plan actually being delivered and happening as the plan predicted. And I think it's because when we talk about the world being VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and it's so true that I think what we've increasingly started to learn, and we're learning it from the private sector, they've been adopting agile practices for a long time and sprinting and chunking work into 2 weekly bursts, is what we're realizing is you need to start with a really specific problem and be really clear about how that problem presents itself for your customers, and then start from there, and then have a team that is dedicated to the change and that works in kind of 2 weekly bursts of activity to test and learn, test and learn, test and learn. And then you're iterating all the time the solutions with your customers, using talent from across the organisation, as we're starting to kind of work in these small multidisciplinary teams. And then once you've kind of iterated whatever the solution is to the problem with your customers, then you're more likely to have something that's really scalable and that's really viable and effective. And then you can put your resources behind taking it to scale. And we're only just learning this. We've probably been at this for about 12 months, but we are starting to see some benefits. And we're starting to see some benefits both in terms of pace, but also in really addressing problems that have been holding us back for a long time in really fulfilling our potential as an organisation. So it's fascinating, and it involves a lot of discipline. So a lot of the traditional project and programme management disciplines are transferable, but instead of having some sort of giant Gantt chart which sort of sets it all out as if it's controllable and predictable, you're embracing ambiguity and uncertainty.
And one of the things that I looked at when thinking about risk and crisis for organisations as well, and particularly in this space, is everybody starts with their plan and process, but quite often they stop at the plan and process. But when you really think about it, it's the decisions on the journeys and actually the behaviours that sit behind those decisions that enable an organisation to kind of change well. And in some of the organisations we have ended up working with, because they are so purposeful, they felt as though actually being quite so upfront, and you said it earlier, actually, to really be very clear about your mission, but also to change once, to actually make that change really strategic. But others have felt that might be a bit unkind. Can we really tell everybody the whole scale of the challenge up front? But I would say it's probably actually, it is unkind not to allow people to really understand what's needed and then to do it just once.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we learned that in the pandemic. We just decided to be super transparent about the financial challenge. And of course, what did it do? It made it a shared problem. It made it a collective problem. And I was saying to people, I don't have all the answers. Please keep telling me what you're hearing, what you're learning, what you think we should do next. So it made it a kind of whole organization problem. And I think as leaders, we so have to wear our egos lightly. And I think that's what I'm kind of realizing through this work is, my role is to make sure that everything connects to our purpose. But it is very much about modeling the values and creating the conditions in which other people can solve the problems. And chances are that big strategic problem that I've been worrying about in my little ivory tower for years and years and years has already been solved by one of our frontline staff. They've already got the answer. So it's about understanding. It's about going to the work and learning in and through the work. And I remember 10 years ago listening to somebody who said, oh, chief executives should spend all their time on the balcony, gazing out the window, horizon scanning. Yes, you have to do a bit of that. Of course you do, because you've got to be, thinking 3 to 5 years ahead. But you also need to be deeply connected to your customers and connected to the work, because the learning comes in and through the work. So it's really challenging. And I think, I'm just trying to show up in a relational way and trying to move away from those sort of more industrialized command and control approaches to just being true to myself, true to the values of the organization, really relational, allowing people to have a voice, kind of recognizing that people have got fantastic talents, and then kind of putting individuals from different teams with different talents together to work collectively on a problem. And it's beginning to really work, and it's really energizing. And I'm having to learn a whole new skill set, because agile practices is not something I think that the voluntary sector has excelled at, and we've got a lot to learn from the private sector.
Yeah, I can see how energized you are when you're talking about this, actually, and hear it in your voice. It's how enthusiastic you are. I want to get back to that shift, though, because moving from a traditional approach to program management, project management of change, moving from that to what you're talking about, that's a bigger, I would have thought, the cultural change that requires is probably more challenging, actually, than the change of just restructuring an organisation. And I just wondered what you felt the risks were of managing that culture shift to a completely different way of working, because you must have had some staff who were not able to think in that way, and you must have had some staff who felt uneasy with that completely different way of doing things. I'm just interested in the risks, how you conceived of the risks and what you were doing about it at the time.
Yeah. So I don't think we've cracked it. So I think we knew that the traditional programmatic way of working wasn't delivering results. We kind of overscoped our big, hairy, audacious goals, and these programs became overly bureaucratic, overly top-down, overly controlling, and we kind of paralyzed ourselves into not inaction, but quite slow action. So I knew that continuing with that way wasn't the right way. And I'd read and spoken to a lot of leaders who said actually adopting agile ways of working is culturally really challenging, but it will deliver benefits over time. We're only a year in. We still have skeptics. It comes associated with a whole new language, which is really alienating for a lot of staff.
Because it sounds very like commercial, doesn't it?
And that's really, really commercial.
Yeah.
And we're talking about customers, and we're talking about sprints and multidisciplinary teams and all these kind of techniques. So that can be really alienating for staff. It means senior leaders not always knowing what's going on. and trusting the process and not always saying, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Our project managers, who were used to a lot of control, have had to kind of give up what they perceive as some of their control. It's slow at the beginning because we're learning a whole new way of working. And I'm not sure we've been strong enough at the storytelling. We're now kind of catching up and starting to tell better stories about the sprints that are working, why they're working, the outcomes that we're starting to see. But we kind of went into it as a whole organisation experiment, possibly a little naively, and we're learning as we're going along. And I would say, as more staff experience it, they're feeling the benefits. But I'll be honest with you, we have had feedback from staff saying this feels alienating. I can't see its relevance to me. You're telling me that all the old ways that I was taught to do things are no longer valuable. And we're not saying that. We're saying you need to adapt it and be kind of more flexible. But yeah, it's not easy.
No, I mean, it really does not sound easy at all. But all admiration to you for really pushing it through. Um, uh, so I guess my question to you as the chief exec would be, how did your approach to risk and your board's approach to risk have to shift in order to really lean into this new way of working?
So I think there is a tension, and I think it'll always be there, between kind of testing, learning, experimenting, and not knowing what the answers are, and knowing that some of your experiments are going to fail, with the regulatory requirements on charity around compliance. And we are held to very high standards by the public, by our donors, by our regulators. And because of our values, we often have to behave in a way that is whiter than white. And I don't think that's a bad thing. We can't identify shortcomings in others and demand better of, for example, the NHS, because I work in a health charity, if we're not also holding the mirror up to ourselves. So we have this constant tension between trustees' desire for compliance, following rules, having detailed policies and procedures, with agile practices that are about learn in and through the work and be open to experimentation, failure, and learn from the work. And it's a tension, and I think it's actually quite a healthy tension. But we have had a few, our digital maturity is not where it needs to be, and we've had a couple of instances in the last 18 months of kind of manual errors where we've made some mailing errors. We had an IT security incident earlier in the year, and obviously that makes trustees nervous. And what they tend to do when they're nervous is demand yet more assurance that you're complying with agreed policy and process. And that often mitigates against experimentation and taking risks. And we just have this, I suppose the way that we're handling it at the moment is to talk about it. And I'm trying to encourage the trustees to make sure that their demands around compliance and risk management are proportionate, because governance should be an enabler to strategy delivery.
And from my side, so actually at River Effra, we've got a scientific team of performance psychologists, and they come from the world of actually working with the military and elite sport. But in performance psychology, there's been an argument between what is resilience and what is robustness. And in short, resilience is your ability to bounce back from a problem, and robustness is your ability to withstand pressure and change. And if you think about that at a kind of cultural level for an organisation, How robust do you need to be? How much of your delivery for the people you are there for has to be absolutely consistent and can't fail on a kind of, I guess, assurance and compliance level? But what does that do to your resilience to be able to change and to be able to be, I guess, agile and think of new ways of working?
Yeah, I love that distinction between resilience and robustness. I mean, we've done a piece of work with the trustees around our risk appetite against the broad categories of activities that we undertake. And obviously for some, like safeguarding, I mean, many stroke survivors are extremely and unfortunately increasingly vulnerable. Yeah. And so, we absolutely follow best practice in terms of safeguarding, patient safety investigations, anything to do with patient safety and beneficiary well-being. We would, that's where 100% compliance is absolutely necessary. But then there are other areas like research, classic example. I mean, you're only going to succeed in research research is by its nature experimental, isn't it? I mean, you have a hypothesis, but you don't actually know until you do the research with humans in a real life setting if that hypothesis is going to work or not. So on research, yes, we will have very robust processes around awarding grants, and our research governance is very robust. But then we have a low risk appetite when it comes to the actual research and the findings of it, because we recognise that if
You're not going to push the agenda.
exactly. So I think you have to just calibrate your risk appetite according to the nature of the activity. And obviously, cybersecurity, IT security, I'm sure it's come up in all your interviews.
It's a huge one at the moment.
It's a huge one, and it's top of our risk register and has been for the last 3 years probably. And we are moving towards ISO 27001 because we know we have to really be able to assure our beneficiaries and our donors that we are doing everything possible to safeguard them and their data. But that again is an area of hidden cost that often our kind of donors don't see, but is absolutely essential, and where you kind of just can't afford to take any risk.
Yeah. And I guess in a way that comes back to how you use your funds well and what an unrestricted fund and a restricted fund really looks like, and that freedom to be able to actually spend the money in the right way.
Yeah. And, we are a fortunate charity. When we went into the pandemic, we did have quite healthy reserves, and we continue to have healthy reserves, but we have now designated some of those reserves for the purposes of accelerating our strategy, because yes, those reserves are there to deal with shocks, but most importantly, what are they there to do? Support the charity to achieve its mission and purpose. So that's kind of quite exciting, but we're being careful not to spend the money on hypotheses or assumptions or ideas. As I said, we're going back to really understanding problems, testing and learning, finding a solution that's viable, and then putting the money behind it to scale.
So I'm obsessed with this whole shift from program management and agile. Sorry, I'm going to come back to that. I'll make no apology for it. So I have never met a charity chief exec who didn't talk about how siloed their organisation is. Like, I think maybe all organisations in every sector are like it, actually. But I think charities can be very siloed, by which I mean different departments not talking to each other, not working together, different teams within the same department not talking to each other, not working together. It's kind of a perennial thing. But it's a thing you can get away with a lot more with that program management approach than you can with the sort of agile team around the problem approach that you're talking about. So you must have had that issue. You must have come up against that issue of people. It's not a criticism of your organisation, because as I say, it's everywhere. So was that an issue for you, that breaking down those silos? And do you have any, I bet people listening would just love to know if you've got any tips about how to make that happen, because it's so hard.
Yeah, I mean, every organisation I've ever worked in has always had silos and subcultures. I mean, the people working in a services culture are very different from the people working in the research team, are very different from people who are working in fundraising, marketing, and we've got so many subcultures.
Yes.
And I think I'd always been born and brought up understanding that if you have an integrated planning process, i.e. if your cross-departmental plans truly align behind shared goals, you crack the challenge of silo working. But that's never been my experience. And my experience has been that you spend months and months and months on this damn planning and budgeting process trying to force integrated working. And it's superficial. It doesn't actually really address some of the underlying cultural and behavioural kind of barriers.
Yeah.
And so I don't know whether we're going to ever quite crack it, because people have an affinity to their natural team, don't they? And that's right. And I think, it's right to have communities of practice of people with similar disciplines, because they learn and share and feel comfortable with each other. But what we're trying to do with our new ways of working is create these multidisciplinary teams.
Yeah.
Small, the teams are no more than 8 people, and they are all from different disciplines that are needed to tackle that particular challenge and to get to the outcome that that team has defined. Now, interestingly, that then changes the role of the project manager or the delivery manager, because their role becomes, yes, about making sure that there's coordination and that everyone's working to one single plan, but their role also becomes about the health of the team and being quick to pick up on unhelpful team dynamics. So they host daily stand-ups, they do weekly reflective meetings. There's a lot of focus on the project manager or the delivery manager on the practices and how people are showing up, as well as what they're doing. And that is really starting to kind of break down some of these kind of cultural barriers and get everybody kind of aligned behind one single goal. And it's working on a small scale way more effectively than our giant organisation-wide integrated planning process ever worked in the past. So the hope is that what we can have is a lot more of these kind of experiments that are genuinely multidisciplinary, because I think that really does break down the barriers. And we're lucky because we're organised in a way that most of our work is delivered at place level. So we're organised in 10 localities. And what those 10 localities do is they are a kind of microcosm of the whole stroke association. Yeah. And so that is a place where you have people from services, fundraising, kind of engagement, comms, all working together at a place level. So I think that does help to break down some of the silos as well.
And I think, from what you're saying, Juliet, it's kind of, it seems obvious, but it's so missed quite often that actually at the heart of change and effective change is the people who actually do the work and the people who work for you. And you're saying if you put them and you enable them to really deliver that change, it is possible to get there. It's a difficult journey, and it's a difficult journey to ask people to think about a new way of working. But actually, if you can do that, you can deliver the transformation that's needed in these organisations, particularly at a time when actually the sector has got quite an acute crisis around it.
Yeah, I mean, we've invested a lot in distributed leadership. I mean, we have leadership development programs that we've been running for some time now that are for everyone in the organisation. Everyone is a leader. The people who often shine most on the leadership development courses are our frontline staff, our frontline stroke support coordinators. But what are they doing with stroke survivors? They're transferring power and agency to stroke survivors. They're coaching stroke survivors all the time to avoid a dependency on us, but to enable that person to kind of come to terms with a traumatic event and to chart their own recoveries. So actually, what are they doing? They're practicing leadership skills. They're practicing coaching. They're working with multiple agencies at place level to get the support that this individual requires. They're doing a lot of system influencing. And they haven't always realised just quite how much they are operating as leaders. So we've been I think the new ways of working are working, they're starting to work quite well because we've had a kind of culture of kind of leadership development at all levels and distributed leadership for some time. But yeah, it means senior leaders have to turn up differently. We have to turn up very lightly.
I think from a leadership perspective, that is a fantastic point to kind of leave it there. We could carry on talking, I think, for ages, but Juliet, thank you.
Thank you so much, Juliet.
If you're listening and you thought that this was an interesting discussion, please do share on your socials and engage with us at #WhitewaterLeadership. Thank you for joining us, and Polly.
Yeah, thank you from me as well. And do follow me and River Effra on LinkedIn to get news of all podcast episodes as they drop.